Beneath the victories carved into monuments and the speeches etched into memory, there are stories the world was never meant to hear. Shadows of steel convoys, erased experiments, and sealed chambers whisper through forgotten files, speaking of betrayals too vast to confess. What lies buried is not only machinery and paper, but the weight of secrets powerful enough to warp the course of history. Secrets governments still smother, lest the truth itself prove more dangerous than war. In the late spring of 1945, when Berlin lay in ruins and the Reich was dissolving into surrender, a series of transmissions slipped through the clutter of collapsing German command networks. Buried within Enigma-encoded traffic and Luftwaffe, chatter was a coded reference to Operation Seeschlange, Sea Serpent. Allied cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park intercepted fragments, U-234, U-3523, and several other Type 9 and Type Chadium U-boats were mentioned in conjunction with rendezvous, points stretching from Kiel to Kristiansand. But unlike ordinary evacuation orders, these signals carried unusual urgency and were accompanied by priority phrases reserved for Reichsführer SS Himmler's office. By May 5, 1945, reports from Norwegian fishing vessels noted the sudden nighttime departure of at least 3 submarines without navigation lights. These craft were said to move in strict radio silence, accompanied by armed patrol craft that discouraged any approach. When Allied units entered Kristiansand days later, submarine pens stood empty. Standard Kriegsmarine records listed the vessels as scuttled or lost. Yet the convoy's trail would not fade so easily. On 14 May 1945, an RAF reconnaissance aircraft flying off the coast of Argentina reported sighting a conning tower resembling a Type 9 boat. No formal interception followed. The war in Europe had officially ended, and the priority of such sightings was minimal compared to the redeployment of forces to the Pacific. Still, the report was logged under the heading Miscellaneous Naval Activity, South Atlantic. That log later disappeared from the British Public Record Office, though a carbon copy was found in 1982 by researchers combing through Argentine naval intelligence archives. The nature of what these submarines carried has fueled decades of speculation. U-234 is known to have carried uranium oxide bound for Japan, intercepted by the U.S. Navy, and diverted to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But the Seeschlange boats were said to hold something different. An internal memorandum from Major Harold T. Gersten of U.S. Naval Intelligence, dated 19 June 1945, referenced unmarked steel containers approximately 2.5 meters in length, extreme hazard precautions, and restricted access, even for ranking Kriegsmarine officers. The containers, according to testimony gathered after the war, were loaded in Bremen in late April under heavy SS guard. Civilian dock workers later testified in Allied courts that crates bore not only military stencils, but also strange alphanumeric codes never before seen in standard German ordnance catalogs. In 1952, sonar mapping expeditions sponsored by the Argentine Navy identified several anomalies off the coast of Patagonia. Metallic objects resembling submarine hulls at depths of 250 meters. Divers reported glimpses of corroded steel structures and possible hatches, though rough seas made recovery impossible. When British naval attachés requested to examine the sites, Argentine authorities quietly closed access, citing national security. What little photographic evidence exists was stored in Buenos Aires archives under the file name Proyecto Serpiente Marina. A decade later, during the political turmoil of 1966, those files vanished, reportedly burned during a purge of military intelligence records. Survivors provide fragmented testimony. In 1949, a former SS radio operator named Ernst Fahlbusch, held in French custody, stated that the Reich had no intention of surrendering everything to the Allies. Some things were to be hidden, to wait. He claimed to have overheard orders, referencing Patagonia, secrecy oaths, and the serpent which never surfaces. French interrogators dismissed his testimony as exaggeration, but the words were transcribed in debriefing notes filed under Bureau Central de Renseignements, Confidential Annex 14 Dro. By the 1970s, whispers of Nazi escape routes through Argentina and Chile had become the subject of books, speculation, and sensational journalism. Yet serious naval historians kept returning to the anomalous loss records of May 1945. U-3523, a Type Vundi Wayne boat, was officially listed as sunk by depth charges off Denmark on 6 May. Still, wreck surveys conducted in 2018 discovered the boat intact, hundreds of kilometers from the reported coordinates. Why the false sinking report? And why had the Kriegsmarine altered logbooks in the final days of war to list some vessels as destroyed before they even departed their pens? In 1993, declassified CIA documents included a heavily redacted file, Seeschlange, subject inconclusive. The surviving pages referenced ongoing Argentine cover-up, possible nuclear materials transfer, and liaison with unknown parties. One note scrawled in the margin, attributed to a case officer in Montevideo, read, "They are afraid of what's still down there." When independent researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests for further details, the agency responded, "Documents withheld in the interest of national defense." The historical record therefore exists as a mosaic of half-truths, intercepted but incomplete signals, vanished files, censored reports, and oral testimonies dismissed by official commissions. Whether the Silent Convoy carried advanced weapons, stolen art, gold reserves, or something even less definable remains unresolved. What is clear is that vessels officially listed as destroyed were sighted alive weeks later, and that post-war sonar confirmed submarine-sized wreckage off the South American coast. The deeper question is why governments, on both sides of the Atlantic, would continue suppressing documents for decades after. Analysts suggest two possibilities. Either the cargo was so dangerous it could not be acknowledged, or its recovery played a role in Cold War weapons development programs too sensitive to admit. Both explanations are consistent with the secrecy, but neither resolves the fate of the vanished submarines. Today, in certain naval intelligence circles, the phrase, "the Silent Convoy," remains shorthand for unresolved wartime mysteries. Among archivists in Berlin, Buenos Aires, and Washington, references to Seeschlange appear sporadically, always truncated, always redacted, always inconclusive. What left Germany's northern ports in May 1945 was never officially recorded in Allied victory archives, and the men who witnessed it at sea seldom lived long enough to testify. Beneath the waves of the South Atlantic, sealed in rust and salt, the story of the Silent Convoy remains unclosed, its hatches unopened, its cargo unrevealed, its silence unbroken. In the final weeks of World War II, as Allied forces advanced into southern Germany, American command authorized a special mission under the codename Operation Harborage. While newspapers in New York and London reported the collapse of the Third Reich, a convoy of unmarked U.S. Army trucks and engineering units slipped into southwestern Germany, under orders not from SHAF headquarters, but directly from the Pentagon. Their target was not Nazi leadership, nor even armament stockpiles. It was knowledge, scientific research, weapons prototypes, and records that could alter the balance of power in the post-war world. The region identified for seizure stretched between Hechingen, Haigerloch, and Horb-am-Neckar, known to locals as the Atomic Triangle. Here, beneath church basements and university laboratories, German scientists had been quietly testing the limits of nuclear fission and jet propulsion. Though the German atomic project lagged far behind Allied Manhattan Project breakthroughs, intelligence intercepts indicated that uranium ore, heavy water reserves, and reactor prototypes remained concealed in scattered sites. What worried American strategists was not that the Germans might succeed, they had already failed, but that the Soviets might inherit the work. On 22 April 1945, Colonel John Lansdale Jr., head of Manhattan Project Security, arrived in France with sealed orders. Within days, specially trained units moved into the Neckar Valley, bypassing traditional command channels. French forces, who by right of occupation were poised to claim the area, found themselves abruptly denied entry. American officers presented curt notices. Restricted zone, U.S. command authority only. French protests were quietly silenced through diplomatic channels. Within hours, guards established cordons, checkpoints, and shoot-to-kill orders against intruders. Witness accounts from locals describe convoys of olive-drab trucks arriving at the castle of Heigerloch, where a small experimental nuclear reactor had been hidden beneath the town church. Villagers recalled soldiers lowering heavy crates into trucks under armed guard. Inside, U.S. personnel discovered uranium cubes suspended in chains, 375 of them, weighing more than half a ton. Reactor logs, handwritten notebooks, and blueprints were packed into sealed containers. The reactor's lead shielding was dismantled, the components tagged with stencils. Property U.S. Army, do not open. What was not recorded in official inventories were additional crates, reportedly stamped with red SS runes, loaded separately and handled only by personnel carrying Manhattan. Project badges. Similar seizures occurred at Hechingen, where experimental jet designs resembling the Messerschmitt P1101 and other late-war prototypes were removed. Local machinists claimed they had been assembling airframes with swept wings and strange fuselage markings never before seen. One eyewitness, a technician named Karl-Heinz Müller, later testified to Allied investigators that the planes were not for Luftwaffe squadrons, they were for something else, something secret. His testimony was entered into debriefing, files marked, restricted Project Paperclip Annex. The Soviets, meanwhile, advanced rapidly from the east. By the time they reached central Germany, much of the most sensitive research material had already disappeared westward. In Moscow's archives, decades later, internal memoranda raged at American obstruction. One note, attributed to NKVD officer Lavrenti Beria, read, "The Americans are stealing everything. They pretend to secure, but they smuggle." Such accusations were not without merit. U.S. cargo planes departed daily from Stuttgart in May 1945, carrying sealed containers bound for Wright Field in Ohio and Los Alamos, New Mexico. By July 1945, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, compiled a classified report titled Scientific Targets in Germany, Post-Seizure Analysis. This document, partially declassified in 1998, listed recovered jet prototypes, V-2 derivative guidance systems, and nuclear experimentation records. Entire sections remain redacted, particularly references to non-standard propulsion assemblies and materials of unknown metallurgical origin. Requests for full declassification have been repeatedly denied under Exemption B1. National Defense. Eyewitnesses among American servicemen offer fragments of corroboration. Sergeant William Corcoran, part of a logistics unit, described crates being loaded at Heigerloch under the personal supervision of men in civilian suits who spoke perfect English but were not Army. These men reportedly carried State Department credentials, though others claimed they were from the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Their presence remains unexplained in surviving manifests. Corcoran's oral history, recorded in 1971, was later filed under Veterans Confidential Collection, Restricted Access. What became of the seized materials remains the most troubling aspect. While some uranium cubes from Heigerloch sit today in museum collections, the majority vanished. In 2005, a research paper by physicist Klaus Henschel documented discrepancies in the official U.S. inventory. Of 1,200 cubes believed produced by the Germans, only 600 were ever formally accounted for. The rest remain untraced. Jet prototypes, reportedly transported to Wright Field, were never displayed publicly, unlike the Mi-262s or V-2s shown to journalists. Instead, they were listed as evaluated and scrapped in Air Technical Intelligence command files. Yet no photographs of their dismantling exist. Historians now argue that Operation Harborage represented not merely a seizure, but a deliberate denial strategy, ensuring the Soviets received nothing of value while simultaneously feeding America's own Cold War arsenal. The secrecy surrounding the operation, however, suggests an additional layer, something too sensitive even for public acknowledgement decades later. Whether this was advanced propulsion research, early radiation weapon concepts, or experimental technologies straddling science and pseudoscience remains uncertain. The paper trail ends abruptly in the summer of 1945. A series of documents marked Harborage Final Disposition were logged as destroyed in 1951. The official explanation cites routine record management, yet notes in the margins of related files hint otherwise. Sensitive, do not circulate. Today, when German archives are combed for evidence of late war programs, a curious silence surrounds the Neckar Valley seizures. Local testimonies persist, echoing stories of long night convoys and heavily guarded trains. But the official histories of both Germany and the United States remain vague, referring only to recovery of nuclear materials. The details, the missing cubes, the secret crates, the vanished prototypes, remain absent. The mission's name, Operation Harborage, was chosen to suggest protection, a safe harbor. In reality, it represented the opposite: concealment, appropriation, and erasure. Beneath the celebrations of VE Day, in the shadowed towns of southwestern Germany, the United States quietly began laying the foundations of Cold War supremacy. The cost was not only measured in material denied to the Soviets, but also in a truth buried so deep within classified vaults that even today, half a century later, its outlines remain in darkness. In the early years of the Cold War, Albania stood as one of Europe's most impenetrable fortresses. Under Enver Hoxha's communist regime, the country closed itself off from both west and east, a rigid Stalinist enclave pressed against the Adriatic. To London and Washington, Albania represented more than an isolated dictatorship. It was a weak seam in the Iron Curtain. A plan was conceived to destabilize the regime, ignite rebellion in the mountains, and provide a model for anti-communist uprisings elsewhere. The codename whispered in briefing rooms was not fixed, but operatives later recalled one symbol recurring: the Black Eagles. The plan took form in 1949. Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, and the newly formed CIA worked in tandem to recruit Albanian émigrés from displaced persons camps in Italy, Greece, and West Germany. These men, former royalists, nationalists, and anti-communist partisans, were trained in sabotage, radio operation, and small unit tactics. Camps were established in Malta and Cyprus, where recruits learned demolition under British instructors. American advisors introduced them to clandestine communications equipment and escape and evasion drills. Promises were made. They would not fight alone. The people would rise. Support would flow from the skies. Between late 1949 and 1951, the operations began. Small teams of 2 to 6 men were inserted by boat or parachute into the Albanian highlands, often under cover of darkness. On 26 October 1949, the first landing took place near Karaburan Peninsula, delivered by a British vessel posing as a fishing trawler. The men slipped ashore carrying Sten guns, explosives, and coded radios. Within days, their presence was known to Albanian security forces. Patrols closed in, arrests were made, and villagers suspected of assisting were executed as examples. Reports trickled back through compromised channels. Every landing, every drop ended in disaster. Years later, fragments of the truth emerged. In 1978, the defection of former British intelligence officer Kim Philby, later revealed as a Soviet tow mole, explained what many operatives already suspected: the missions had been betrayed from the start. As a senior figure in the SIS Balkan desk during the late 1940s, Philby had direct access to planning details. He relayed landing sites, dates, and identities to Moscow. The Soviets, in turn, provided Hoxha's feared Sigurimi security service with everything it needed to ambush the infiltrators. What should have been clandestine penetrations became orchestrated traps. Official files confirm the scale of the disaster, though not its full human cost. A declassified CIA memorandum from 1954, heavily redacted, admitted that a substantial number of Albanian émigré operatives failed to return. Another from the British Foreign Office stated bluntly, the majority were captured or killed. Estimates suggest as many as 300 men were sent into Albania during the 2-year campaign. Of these, fewer than 30 survived. Many were executed after brutal interrogation. Others vanished into labor camps, their names scrubbed from public record. Family members left behind in Albania faced imprisonment, exile, or worse. The secrecy surrounding the operation was intense. Survivors who escaped capture were resettled quietly in Europe under new identities. Some spoke years later of betrayal, of landing zones lit by lanterns to guide security forces, of radio codes already deciphered before transmissions were made. Their testimonies were dismissed by officialdom as bitterness, yet patterns of failure were undeniable. In 1992, after the fall of communism, Albanian state archives briefly opened to researchers. Within the files of the Sigurimi were interrogation, transcripts of captured agents often signed with trembling handprints instead of signatures, evidence of torture. Many transcripts bore annotations in Russian, confirming Soviet oversight. What remains striking is how thoroughly the Western sponsors erased the episode from their histories. No medals were awarded, no commemorations made. Families of the lost were given little information, only vague assurances of sacrifice in the fight against communism. In Britain, when journalists pursued the story during the 1980s, government spokesmen denied involvement or claimed operations were independent émigré actions. Only after declassification in the 1990s did fragments surface in official records, confirming Anglo-American orchestration. Even then, the files remain incomplete. Requests for further details have been rejected under clauses citing sources and methods. Among Cold War historians, the Albanian affair stands as one of the most disastrous covert operations of the early era. Its failure hardened Hoxha's paranoia, leading him to build one of the most isolated security states in Europe. For Western intelligence, it represented a humiliation concealed by secrecy and bureaucratic euphemism. The phrase "Black Eagles" appears nowhere in official archives, only in oral testimonies of surviving recruits who claimed their handlers invoked Albania's national symbol to rally them. In 2003, a weathered ledger surfaced in the Albanian National Archives, mislabeled under agricultural records. Inside were lists of captured enemy agents from 1949-1951. Many names matched those recruited from émigré camps in Italy and Greece. Margins contained terse notations: executed, deported, disappeared. The ledger was withdrawn from public access weeks later, returned to restricted collections. No official reason was given. Today, the operation survives in fragments, scattered testimonies, redacted memoranda, and erased names. Its story lies in what is missing as much as in what remains. The silence of officialdom, the denial of responsibility, the careful destruction of files, all point to a truth too embarrassing to admit fully. The Black Eagles were betrayed before they touched Albanian soil, victims of a Cold War played not only in shadows, but in double shadows, where friends were enemies, allies were traitors, and the cost was measured in unmarked graves across a sealed land. When Japan's surrender was announced in August 1945, Allied forces expected to discover the wreckage of an empire stretched to its limits. What they did not expect, though intelligence whispers had long suggested it, was the existence of biological warfare units operating outside the notorious Manchurian complex of Unit 731. Among them, largely absent from public record, was Unit 8604, established in Guangzhou in 1939 under the cover of the South China Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit. While its official purpose suggested public health, the reality was concealed beneath layers of classification and denial. Evidence of Unit 8604's activities surfaced only briefly during the American occupation. Initial reports from U.S. Army Medical Corps officers described abandoned facilities in Guangzhou, containing sealed glass vials, refrigeration units powered by generators, and walls lined with handwritten charts recording exposure times and infection results. The charts bore notations in precise medical kanji, cross-referenced with serial numbers rather than names. Test subjects, later identified as prisoners from Chinese labor camps, had been catalogued according to age, weight, and resistance profile. Disease agents noted included plague, cholera, anthrax, and unfamiliar strains marked only as X11 and R7. A report dated 17 September 1945 by Major William F. Haggerty of the U.S. Army's Epidemic Intelligence Service summarized the findings. Evidence suggests human experimentation for the purpose of aerosolized pathogen development, optimized for aircraft dispersal. Recommend immediate seizure of all surviving documentation and transfer under restricted classification. That report, preserved in the National Archives until 1969, disappeared after requests for declassification. Only carbon copies in private collections prove it ever existed. Like Unit 731, Unit 8604's officers faced little accountability. Testimonies gathered from captured medical staff indicated that, in the weeks before surrender, much of the unit's evidence was deliberately destroyed. Prisoners were executed, samples incinerated, records burned in hospital courtyards. Yet several crates, reportedly marked with U.S. Army property seals, were transported from Guangzhou to Yokosuka under guard. These crates, according to dock workers' recollections, were placed aboard naval vessels bound for San Francisco. Their contents were never inventoried publicly. In 1947, during early U.S. congressional inquiries into Japanese war crimes, reference was made to subsidiary biological units operating in southern China. Unit 8604 was briefly mentioned in testimony by Dr. Edwin Hill, chief of Fort Detrick's Special Operations Division. Hill stated that data recovered in China has proven invaluable for ongoing defense-related research. When pressed, he invoked classification restrictions. The matter was dropped from hearings, replaced by the more familiar narrative of Unit 731 in Manchuria. The Chinese nationalist government attempted to raise the issue during war crimes tribunals in Nanjing. A file marked Case 13, Epidemic Prevention Unit, Guangzhou, was submitted, containing affidavits from surviving prisoners and local villagers who recalled outbreaks following Japanese vaccination drives. These outbreaks mirrored diseases cultivated in the unit's laboratories. Yet when the tribunal's official record was published, Case 13 was absent. Rumors circulated that American legal advisors pressured the court to omit evidence that might expose ongoing U.S. use of Japanese research. By the 1950s, Unit 8604 vanished from historical record. Unlike 731, whose horrors became undeniable, Guangzhou's program remained buried. Only scattered references survive in declassified documents. One CIA report from 1957, Biological Potential, People's Republic of China, contains a footnote. Early PRC biological development may be augmented by former Japanese assets in Guangdong, though much was appropriated by U.S. forces in 1945. The implication was clear. Washington had taken possession of material that Beijing later sought in vain. Eyewitness testimonies, often overlooked, offer chilling detail. In 1965, a Chinese physician named Li Zhong, who had been forced to work as a translator for Japanese doctors, described experiments in which prisoners were strapped into chambers and exposed to aerosols released through ceiling vents. Some died within hours. Others lingered for days. Li claimed to have seen U.S. officers photographing the chambers after Japan's surrender, nodding in approval. His testimony was recorded by researchers in Hong Kong, published in a small medical ethics journal, and promptly discredited in Western reviews as Soviet-inspired propaganda. Yet the trail of Unit 8604 continues to surface in unexpected places. In 1998, renovation work in Guangzhou uncovered a sealed basement beneath the former military hospital grounds. Inside were rusted surgical tables, glass ampules labeled in Japanese, and fragments of English-language tags reading, "Property of U.S. Occupation Forces." Local authorities quickly sealed the site, citing biohazard concerns. Journalists who attempted to investigate were denied access. The official explanation referred to standard wartime facilities. Independent scientists who examined recovered ampules found traces of Bacillus anthracis DNA. What remains most haunting is the absence of accountability. No Unit 8604 officer was ever tried. The handful identified in occupation records were later absorbed into Japanese universities or medical institutions. 1. Dr. Yutaka Nagao resurfaced in the 1950s as a professor at Kyoto University, publishing papers on aerosol transmission of respiratory diseases. His wartime affiliations went unmentioned. When interviewed in 1972, Nagao dismissed allegations as Chinese fabrications, refusing further comment. The legacy of Unit 8604 is therefore one of deliberate erasure. Unlike the infamous experiments of Manchuria, which entered public consciousness through survivor accounts, the Guangzhou program remains obscured by destroyed files, censored hearings, and the convenient fog of Cold War politics. The silence persists not because evidence is lacking, but because fragments that do survive point directly to post-war exploitation rather than justice. For the families of victims, no acknowledgement was ever made, no reparations granted, no memorial erected. Today, in certain restricted corners of military medical archives, references to South China data sets remain locked under classifications dating to 1946. Researchers petitioning for access encounter repeated denials, citing national defense. As one historian remarked, Unit 8604 is not forgotten, it is actively hidden. The ghosts of its experiments linger in sealed files, in vanished crates, and in the long shadows of a war that ended not in truth, but in silence. In 1960, under the frozen wastes of northwestern Greenland, U.S. Army engineers began an audacious construction project cloaked in secrecy. Publicly, the installation was presented as Camp Century, a scientific research base studying ice, cores, and polar geology. Behind the cover story, however, lay the reality of Operation Iceworm, a covert plan to deploy up to 600 medium-range nuclear missiles in tunnels cut beneath the ice sheet, aimed at targets across the Soviet Union. The project represented the pinnacle of Cold War ambition, invisible, mobile, and undetectable. Yet in the archives, fragments suggest something else was buried there, something never retrieved. Camp Century was a marvel of engineering. Between 1960 and 1963, teams carved a lattice of tunnels stretching more than 2 miles, reinforced with steel arches and snow compactors. Diesel generators provided power, while laboratories and barracks gave the base the outward appearance of a polar science station. Officially, the facility was abandoned in 1967 after the ice proved unstable, collapsing walls and threatening cave-ins. What was not disclosed publicly was the discovery of a secondary chamber, sealed, unlisted in engineering blueprints, and accessible only through a concealed hatch beyond the main storage galleries. References to this chamber appear in declassified correspondence between the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Atomic Energy Commission. A memorandum dated 12th of February 1965, titled Special Compartment, Century Annex, mentions placement of materials not scheduled for retrieval. Another marked Eyes Only, Strategic Resources Division, lists Package Series J as delivered to Greenland in late 1964 under escort of the Military Air Transport Service. No public record exists of what Package J contained, though margins scrawled in pencil note. Requires reinforced shielding, 20 tons lead lining. Local Danish officials were kept in the dark. Under treaty agreements, Greenland was not to host nuclear weapons. Yet multiple Danish parliamentary inquiries in the late 1960s revealed evidence of deception. One whistleblower, former Danish intelligence officer Niels Anker Jensen, testified in 1971 that Camp Century was never only a science project. There were shipments that bypassed customs, shipments that Danish officers were not permitted to approach. His testimony was suppressed under national security law and only resurfaced after his death in 1998. Satellite reconnaissance during the 1970s revealed anomalies at the site. Thermal scans showed faint heat signatures beneath layers of ice where Camp Century's generators had long been inactive. Analysts described the formations as geometrically regular, consistent with artificial voids. A 1978 CIA briefing, partially declassified in 2010, refers obliquely to century residual hazards and notes: retrieve or monitor, decision postponed, recommend denial strategy. The file was abruptly terminated with no conclusion. The most troubling clue emerged in 1995, when Ice Corps researchers drilling near the abandoned camp retrieved samples contaminated with cesium-137 and cobalt isotopes. Though the contamination was attributed to fallout from atmospheric nuclear testing, private correspondence between scientists reveals doubts. One glaciologist noted, "The isotope ratios don't match open-air detonations. They look more like controlled releases." Shortly after these findings, funding for further drilling in the area was abruptly redirected to other sites. What might have been stored in the forgotten chamber remains a matter of speculation. Some suggest experimental warheads intended for testing Arctic survivability. Others point to classified propulsion experiments, possibly tied to nuclear-powered missile concepts. A minority of analysts argue for something more dire: disposal of unstable nuclear materials unfit for deployment, sealed in ice with the assumption that the Greenland cap would remain frozen for centuries. In the context of accelerating climate change, such assumptions are now dangerously outdated. Danish archives briefly opened a window into the mystery in 2008. Among declassified cables was one message from the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen, dated 14 July 1966, reporting Greenland package secure, chamber sealed, extraction not feasible under present conditions. The phrase "extraction not feasible" suggests intent to recover at a later date, an intent apparently abandoned. Within months, Camp Century was closed, its tunnels left to collapse under the shifting ice. No follow-up cable references the chamber again. Today, satellite imagery of the region reveals subsidence in the ice sheet above the old camp. Researchers note meltwater channels forming at increasing depth, threatening to expose what lies beneath. Danish environmental studies estimate that by 2070, parts of Camp Century, including its waste, fuel, and possibly nuclear remnants, may surface into meltwater streams flowing into the Arctic Ocean. In closed-door sessions of the Folketing, politicians have raised alarm about a potential radiological hazard concealed by foreign powers. Official statements to the public remain bland, citing ongoing monitoring. The silence from Washington is louder still. Freedom of Information Act requests filed since the 1980s have consistently met with denials, citing continued relevance to national defense. In one case, released documents had entire pages replaced with the phrase "page intentionally omitted." When pressed, Pentagon spokesmen insist that Camp Century contained nothing beyond ordinary construction materials. Yet in 2012, a leaked Army Corps engineering report referred to contingency scenarios in event of containment breach at Century Annex. The term "annex" does not appear in any declassified blueprint. For now, Operation Iceworm remains frozen in uncertainty. Its tunnels, collapsing deeper each year, conceal whatever was sealed within. Its records, redacted and fragmented, tell only half the story, and its legacy, denied in official history, lingers as a silent hazard under shifting ice, waiting, perhaps, to emerge. Whether what lies beneath is a forgotten cache of warheads, discarded experiments, or something more unstable, the truth lies buried in a chamber carved by secrecy and sealed by denial, beneath a landscape that no longer promises permanence. The silence of the archives is not absence but design. Names vanish, crates dissolve into myth, and wrecks sleep under waves and ice, guarded not by chance, but by intention. The more the evidence slips away, the louder the questions echo. Toink, the end? What was hidden may outlive the men who concealed it, waiting for the moment when history's vaults crack open and the forbidden truths spill into the light.